Okay, perfect. So thank you very much indeed for having accepted this invitation, the invitation for this talk. And I'm really pleased to talk to you. I have a very introductory note about you, and then we can start with my questions. You can also, feel free to correct me if something is not updated. So Agnes Callard is an associate professor or a professor now, I don't know, of philosophy at the
Associate
University of
professor.
Chicago.
Yeah.
Right, okay. So primary areas of specialization are ancient philosophy and ethics. She's also noted for her popular writing and work on public philosophy. In 2018, she published her book, Aspiration, the Agency of Becoming. And she'd also edited the book on anger, 2020, but she has also written extensively on emotion. So the first question, Agnes, is, I'm quoting you, the name I will give to the rational process by which we work to care about or love or value or desire something new is aspiration. Aspiration, as I understand it, is a distinctive form of agency directed at the acquisition of values. End of quote. I would be thankful if you could elaborate on this topic, why aspiration and why not desire, or just like generally, why did you choose to write on aspiration?
I think of desire as narrower. So aspiration gives rise to desires, but the natural complement of a desire, that is what you desire to, you'll desire maybe to do something or to have something, or you could desire a person, right? These are ways that we can talk about desire. And an aspiration is, you could frame it as a desire, but it would be a desire to be a certain kind of person. So that has a really wide scope, and it's going to give rise to a bunch of the other kinds of desires, right? So if I want to become the sort of person who appreciates classical music, that's going to give rise to desires to have some CD or to attend some performance or to be able to appreciate some particular, bit of some music. So the sort of thesis of my book is that the person you become is not entirely out of your own hands. You have some control over who you end up as. And what I mean by who you end up as is what you care about. That's really what a person is, as I understand it. A person is their commitments and concerns and values and investments. And so that's who you really are. And to some degree, you control that.
Right, but at the same time, I saw and I see that you make it. You make a distinction between aspiration and ambition, if I'm not wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
I quote you again: a medical student whose final target was money, the approval of her parents, or social status would not count as an aspirant in my sense. I discussed this distinct phenomena, which I call ambition. What is the difference? End of quote, sorry. What is the difference, Agnes? I would be happy to, I like to hear the difference between ambition and aspiration.
Yeah. So when you have an ambition, then there's some value that you already possess. You already value it, but you don't yet succeed in having the thing that you value. So you might already value money or social status, right? But you don't have the money or the social status. And we call a value an ambition when of that sort, when it's like it's pretty big and might direct a lot of your activity. But in the case of aspiration, you don't already value the thing. So if you're trying to value classical music, it's not that you already value it and then you're just, trying to work that out. You're actually trying to learn something. So the ambitious person doesn't think they have anything to learn value-wise. They already know why they want to be a doctor, the ambitious doctor, right? Whereas the aspiring doctor says to herself, I want to understand what it is to care for people in the way that doctors do. I don't understand that yet. That's something I'm on my way to figuring out.
Right, wonderful. But again, can I ask you that about other philosophers in history of philosophy? Because we also quote Aristotle. Do they have written also about aspiration in the sense that you use?
I think I find certain antecedents of my own thought in the ancient world. Probably that's predictable because I spend a lot of time there. So I think both in Plato and in Aristotle, I do find some antecedents of this kind of thought. So in Plato, what I have is the thought of a kind of infinite aspirational project where you're aiming towards a kind of perfection that is probably unattainable in this life, but is nonetheless going to structure everything about what you do. Is that your whole life is really a project of becoming perfect in some way.
Right.
I think Aristotle has an account of aspiration that's quite different from that, and that's because Aristotle didn't believe in the immortality of the soul. So he thought when you die, that's it, right? So whatever you achieve in your life, that's what you can achieve. And so from his point of view, yeah, you spend your younger years engaged in this activity that he called habituation, which I think is like aspiration, namely learning to acquire the virtues by learning to care about those virtues. But you don't spend your whole life doing that, maybe till you're 30 or 35 or whatever. And then it's time to care about other people and not yourself. And that there's a part of your life which is really about activating the virtue you already have rather than trying to acquire more. And so the Platonic, if I had to draw a graph, the Platonic graph of aspiration would look like this, and the Aristotelian one would look like this, right? Where you just go up for a little bit, and then now you're who you are, that person, and you're going to just live as that person.
Agnes, correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, what I understand from your project in Aspiration is that you're actually addressing a three-value scope, or you're addressing you're addressing a sphere that is prior to the application of the values that I've already acquired, right? So it's not that we have the values and I'm going to apply them in my life. It's the process of actually building values or envisioning values, right?
Right, exactly. So one way that I put that is that I think there's two kinds of reasoning we can do. The more familiar kind that decision theorists and philosophers of action feel at home in is reasoning from value. When I already have a whole bunch of values and I have to make decisions about trade-offs, about how to satisfy them, and ambition falls in that territory. But my claim is we don't only reason from value, we also reason towards value. That is, we engage in processes of reasoning that are goal-directed at the state of having values. And so, yeah, those would be pre-values. And I think we need some such theory, because where do you get your values otherwise if you don't have a theory that of reasoning towards them?
A random question. I never, it's not really reflected. It just like springs to my mind now. Where is the source that enables me to envision those values? I mean, it's not that they are not values. They're
right.
It's something else.
Values. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So I think it's really tempting to keep trying to explain these processes by thinking, well, but deep down you have some grip of that value and that's what's driving you. And I want to say, no, there's such a thing as actual newness in this world, where a new thing comes into being that wasn't there before. There wasn't already a seed of it, or a secret map inside your soul that this is where you were always going to go. And so part of the point of my book is to make space for a kind of ethical novelty that I think really is a genuine part of life. And so you want to say, well, what determines it? And the way that I would put it is the process of aspiration grows progressively more organized and directed and purposive. And in the beginning, it's very like random. So if you just look at little kids and how they are engaging in aspirational activity, actually, if you just look at the physical movements of little kids. So my oldest son was in this classroom that was like an experimental classroom, and they would do mappings of how the kid moves through the room. And the teacher showed me the mappings from the beginning of the year versus the end of the year. And at the beginning of the year, and these are like 1.5-year-old kids, it looks like this. They're just going from one spot to another, not spending any time anywhere, right? It's kind of random. And then over the course of the year, the child discovers where it wants to spend time, and spends more time in one area and then moves to the other area. And the thing that looks more organized. And I think that's a really good picture of aspiration. And you ask, at the beginning, where did it come from? And the answer was there wasn't much there. I mean, it was kind of random. And over time, the child is in a way collecting information about what it's finding enjoyable, and then also seeking out more information. And it's doing both of those things in a more and more organized way as it's getting more and more of a grip on what it values.
So, and it is different. You believe that it's different from the shift from feeling something to rationalizing something, or from feeling something to giving value to something, right? It's
I do
not
think
feeling.
it's different. It's well, so I think that, like, actually one of the things that an aspirant can be seeking is feelings. Suppose that I really want to value classical music. It's not like I have a whole bunch of passionate feelings about classical music and I just want to organize, I just want to have a theory of them. No, I want to have those passionate feelings. I don't have them now, right? Or it can even be sense experiences, right? So somebody who really wants to become a wine connoisseur, they can't taste the difference between two different kinds of wine. You taste them, they taste the same. They want to learn to have that taste, right? So it can be very sensory or visceral or emotional kind of experiences that we're even aiming at. We don't have to start with them. We can aim towards them. Right,
perfect. So another question, Agnes, is that, I mean, how can we take social, economic, and political factors that can constrain or enable people's aspiration into account when we are talking about such an agency, especially because I believe that aspiration as a stimulating and thought-provoking exploration in your project and in our becoming is different from what philosophers such as, I don't know, like continental philosophers like Gilles Deleuze name becoming. Simply because according to a philosopher like Gilles Deleuze, desire is not something that can be satisfied or fulfilled, but rather it is a force that drives us to become something different, to move beyond our current state of being. In this sense, desire is always oriented towards the future, towards what we might become. I mean, is there any room for the social, economic, political, I don't know, identitarian aspects that shape my aspiration, shape the way I aspire something in your project?
Good. So I feel like that's a real lacuna in my book. I don't discuss it. I think it's really important. I think that aspiration is something people basically can't do by themselves. They need help, right? Even just my kid, right? It's not like we just threw him anywhere. We threw him into a room full of different kinds of toys with other kids and with like a person who is there to adjudicate disputes. And that's a structure. It's a framework. And I think that our aspirational, like what it is open to us to aspire to is in part a function of our environment. So it's like, I mean, someone might never have heard of classical music, not even know that it exists. Obviously, they're not going to aspire to appreciate it. So there has to be stuff on the table for you as a potential target of aspiration. And those are all like social and structural cultural facts about what aspirations are open to you. And so, for instance, under conditions of oppression, like a really big part of what oppression is the oppression of aspiration. That is not putting a whole set of value options on the table for people. And that's why like liberation involves more than just, the elimination of violence or something. It involves actually a positive, like creating of a welcoming environment for aspiration. But I see that as very separate from the Deleuze question about the infinity of desire. So I do think that there is this kind of conception of desire. I would say it's eros specifically, it's erotic desire, that is kind of infinite, right? So it comes out of, I think, psychoanalytic theory. This thought that desire has an intrinsic restlessness to it, an intrinsically negative mood. Freud thought of that in terms of the death drive, right? And it's very influential in psychoanalytic theory and beyond in critical theory. And there's got to be something to it, but I'm very suspicious of it. That is, like, if you talk to me about infinite desiring or infinite aspiration, the Platonic version of that makes sense to me, where it's just a target that's really, really far away. And so I want to be a god, right? I'm not content to be immortal. I want to be divine. That's really, really hard. So maybe I won't achieve it. And maybe everything that moves me towards it is also just only a partial fulfillment of it. And so I'm dissatisfied and I keep going, and I might keep going over the course of my whole life, but there's at least a nominal target there that would end my desire. And the thought, the Freudian thought, the death drive thought, the kind of like infinitely negating eroticism thought is a thought that no, even in principle, there is no target. There is just this pure restlessness of the spirit. And I think maybe if that's right, it's very lamentable and we should fight against it, but I'm not even sure that it's right. I think it just may be that those people didn't identify the target that is very far off.
Right. I mean, I don't think I don't know, perhaps it's better to formulate that in this question that I actually wrote, which was, when a person is determined to acquire a new set of values, I mean, the example was like being a musician, being a composer, I don't know, being a footballer, It can mean flexibility, but it can also mean, as you said right now, other things like oppression, So one example that I had when I was thinking about your project is a sort of oppression or even soft pressure, which makes a person rethink his or her values or envision new values, but not necessarily in a positive sense. It can be in a negative sense. Can we understand, for example, assimilation of a refugee through aspiration? I like the cultural or political assimilation as a process by which a minority group or people come to resemble to a society in order to feel safer in that sense. Like you're forced to seem to act similar to the host society in that sense, and that, I don't know, I wonder if I can call that aspiration.
So whether or not you can depends on whether or not you see the end point of that change as a good one. So like, I'm an immigrant myself, but maybe more relevantly, I'm the child of immigrants who were, adults when they were immigrating. I was a child. So I just, every child assimilates to their environment. But my parents really took it upon themselves to become Americans. They really wanted to be Americans. And I mean, they still have a heavy accent. Everyone would know they're not born Americans. But they really believed in America. They believed in the idea of like, here's a country of freedom where you can work hard and achieve something with your life, and there aren't all these barriers placed upon you by your society as where they came from, which was Hungary, and where there's true freedom of religion, which there really wasn't where they were growing up. And so they saw themselves assimilating to a culture that they saw as good. And so they wanted to do things like my mom, who was very, very literate and very interested in like Hungarian literature, and she'd read all stuff in Hungary. She's like, okay, now I'm going to read all like American literature. I'm going to read it in English and be really, really kind of like incorporate that into myself. And I see that as good because I see those ideals as good ideals. But something I argue in my book is that if there's a value change towards a worse state, then we can't call it aspiration. That is, the people who think that's a worse state can't call it aspiration. So, relatively late in my book, I consider this speech from the movie Goodfellas, in which there's like this mafioso who's like, ever since I was a little kid, I always wanted to join the mob. And he's telling a story that you could imagine as being aspirational. He really wanted to be a mobster. And there's I imagine Stephen King giving a similar speech. Ever since I was a little kid, I always wanted to be a writer. And he basically does give a quite similar speech. And I think, but those speeches are really different to us. They sound really different because being a writer is a good thing and being a mafioso is not a good thing. And so I want to say, that's a real difference. And the mafioso is not aspiring and the writer is aspiring. And so real distinctions in value matter in terms of applying the category of aspiration.
If you agree, let's move to anger. I mean, another project that you were talking about half an hour ago, perhaps. So anger is a complex emotional response that involves a feeling of injustice and wrongdoing and a desire for retribution or justice. In the book, you suggest that Anger can function as a constructive change, such as social reform or political action, but also leading to rash or impulsive actions that may be regretted later. Yet about anger, you believe that we have been debating a wrong issue, right?
Yes, because I think that people have a kind of hope of salvaging the good kind of anger. They're like, oh, well, when people are rash and impulsive, when they're unreasonable and resentful, that's like the bad kind of anger, but there's like the good kind that I feel that's where I'm totally justified. And my thought is that these things that we don't like about the bad kind of anger, they're just facts about anger. They're not. The idea of a good and bad kind is just always going to correspond to the people you agree with and the people you disagree with. And that it is kind of built into, I think anger is a rational emotion. It has at least a kind of rationality, but the kind of rationality it has is one where if you view it from the outside of that anger, it doesn't look rational. So for example, if you have a reason to be angry, you have a reason to be angry forever. Because that reason never goes away. Even if the person gives you redress and apologizes and whatever, you still have the same reason you had before, namely the injustice. And so that's one bit of like what would be called irrational from the outside, but seems perfectly rational to the angry person. And the other bit is that when you're angry, the world feels broken to you and you don't particularly feel like being productive and pro-social and helpful and doing things that you won't later regret. You want to do things you will regret. That's actually your goal. It's actually your motivation. And someone's like, well, you didn't help things at all by how you reacted. And it's like, well, when you were angry, the world was messed up and you weren't trying to promote its goals. And the particular structure that takes is revenge. That is, you come to see it as good for something bad to happen to someone. Normally, bad things happening to other people isn't good, right? But anger creates this kind of reverso mental framework where all of a sudden now, like if I'm angry at you, your bad is my good. I actually take pleasure and enjoy bad things happening to you. And from the point of view where your injustice created this rupture between us, that makes perfect sense. It's not irrational. It's just not particularly helpful or beneficial to anyone standing on the outside.
Yet philosophers like Martha Nussbaum, if I'm not wrong, like they still look for ways to reconcile anger with morality. Like, I mean, we have terms like righteous indignation. We have terms of Martha Nussbaum like transition anger. Can we, in the end, imagine moralizing anger? Can we moralize anger? Can we have a moral version of anger?
I think so. I think that we can talk about like better and worse ways to deal with your anger. And we can also think about sort of how to engage anger socially and like both at an interpersonal level, but also at a like political level in public fora. And there are definitely going to be better and worse ways to do that. So I don't want to deny that. But I think the idea that there's like a pure kind of anger that's just righteous and good. I think even Martha doesn't really think that. What she calls transition anger is not really anger, right? And she'd be okay with the thing I've just said. That is, what she calls transition anger is just like, oh, that's outrageous. Let's make sure that bad thing never happens again. Which is really just pretty similar to the thought, let's make good things happen in the future. That's a fine motive. Let's make good things happen in the future, or let's make sure bad things don't happen in the future. Both of those seem like good motives, but they're not angry. The angry person is kind of haunted and obsessed by this past evil. And is trying to rectify in some way that past evil.
Right.
And that's exactly what Martha thinks. In a way, she agrees with me that there's no good version of that, in the sense of there's no pure version of that.
Right.
What we can do is we can use the label anger for something else that isn't anger and say, that's good. Yeah, sure, that's fine. But I don't think we've really succeeded in identifying a purified kind of anger.
All right. But let me quote you. Getting angry is easy to understand. I wrong you by, for example, betraying your trust. You find out and that makes you angry. And now you're angry at me for having betrayed you. What is harder to understand is why you might cease to be angry, end of quote. Are you pointing at, I mean, revenge and grunge rather than anger? I mean, I would like to know the relationship that you make between anger and revenge. more specifically, please?
So I think anger is an emotional disposition. So it's not just a feeling, right? It's a feeling that has certain like other recognizable implications. And so, for instance, it has cognitive implications. That is, there are certain beliefs that you're reliably going to find in an angry person. Beliefs like, I was wronged. That's not a feeling. It's not an emotion. It's a belief. The judgment, I was wronged, right? So anger has a cognitive element to it. And it's usually going to be more than that. They're usually going to be actually angry people are very articulate. They can usually tell you exactly what they're angry about. They're not like, oh, I have no idea, right? So that's the cognitive side. And then there's a motivational side to anger. That is, there's stuff that you're inclined to do insofar as you're angry. And I think the answer to what anger motivates you to do is revenge. And, you know, Martha in her book cites Aristotle, who basically says anger is a desire for revenge. That's just what it is. And I think that's a little, you know, that's a little simple. He actually says it's more complicated. It's something like a painful desire for revenge caused by a perceived slight that was undeserved or something. So, but basically a desire for revenge. So when you say I'm equating anger and revenge, I'm not equating them, but what I'm saying is that anger is a complex disposition, and one part of it is the motivation for revenge. Another part of it is the belief that you were wronged.
Right. Okay. There is an author, I mean, Diana Hieronymi, I don't know if I pronounce her name.
Pamela Hieronymi?
Right, Hieronymi, and a lot of others who write on anger as something like harm done to somebody, but that is too personal. Sometimes anger is a result of social and political ideas and differences. I had one example. I don't know if it is really in your definition anger, but I might get angry at a person because he's biased in his view about women, or I might get angry at a person because she is Eurocentric or racist. Do you call it anger?
Sure. I think that is anger. I think if you really got angry about it, it's anger. I think a lot of times when people say they're angry about those things, if you put a heart rate monitor on them, it would show that no elevated heart rate. Then right. I'm like, they're not angry. People sometimes like to say that they're angry, right? Because if I say to you, I'm angry about bias, that's a way to convey to you, I'm a morally good person. So I think you can't always trust the speech act where somebody says that they're angry.
Definitely.
Because it can be conveying something else. But could someone be angry about those things? Absolutely. I think they could be. There could be a one where you put the heart rate monitor on them and it really is elevated.
Okay. Another question, how can we try to, and perhaps I'm being a stoic for the moment, how can we try to cultivate a more reflective and constructive form of anger, one that is focused on addressing social and political and also personal problems rather than simply lashing out at others? I mean, is there any way of cultivating anger?
I think so, but I think it's much more particular than people realize. That is, you can cultivate the good conduct of anger within a specific relationship. So like in my relationship with my husband, like I think that it's really important how we get angry with each other. That we're able to pursue our disputes without like trying to escape them, but also without becoming hostile to each other. And I think it takes many years to try to develop that mode of being angry. And it's particular to him. Like I can't do the thing I do with him with other people because it's tied to his sort of, you know, his natural ways of thinking and emotional sensitivity and whatever, and same vice versa. I also think you can practice like, you know, getting angry on social media and be like, how am I going to deal with this? And develop habits of like how to manage this situation. So I think you absolutely can. It's just like, I don't know that there's something you can do that's going to be a one size fits all solution for every kind of anger.
Well, I have two small questions to finish. So the first question is that, do you see any relationship between aspiration and anger, in the sense that sometimes I think that yeah, I get angry at people because I see the difference of values sometimes, and sometimes in order to reduce that difference or discrepancy, I try to aspire different values.
Yeah.
I mean,
I
as
think
one
that,
example, I mean, anger as one example of a negative encounter with another person. I mean, yeah, you can have other examples like ressentiment, like hatred, yeah, all other different things. But as one example, like in order to maintain this relationship, in order to build this relationship with this person or this in this career, I aspire new values that make me feel less negative um, or yeah, or experience less of these negative feelings like anger.
right. Um, um, I think that, so I think you could aspire to be less angry, first of all, just simplicity. That is a thing you could aspire to. And you would have to think about what are the occasions in which you feel anger and how to deal with that. I think that, I also think that you could, have the view that a lot of the situations in which you get into fights with people are caused by the fact that you don't quite appreciate the things that matter to them.
Mm-hmm.
And so you might think, look, I have to try to come to appreciate those things. And so
Mm-hmm.
that would be like aspiring in order to get out of situations of anger, which is what you're talking about. I think, yes, that's a thing that could happen, but you would have to think that there's really something there. That is not just that I have to sort of learn how to get along with them to sort of fake it or something, but that they really value something that is genuinely important that I can't see yet. And I want to
Mm-hmm.
get that into view. Then yes, it would be aspiration.
Definitely. All right. Okay. And my last question is, I mean, from Nussbaum, who is critical of apathy and sees it as a threat to democracy, to Sarah Ahmad, who thinks of the significance of affects and emotions in shaping political and social relations, to other philosophers such as Michael Slaughter, who has written on the moral significance of empathy and compassion, all agree that there is something crucial in emotions and we cannot simply rationalize them, namely ignore them. What do you think is the role of anger in politics, especially facing various societies which are suffering from polarization and loaded anger?
So I'm not sure that I have like a really good grip on what's going on. I'll tell you what I think, but I warn you that I'm liable to change my mind. I'll tell you what I think like today. The way I'm inclined to think about it at the moment is that it's not so much an anger problem as a license problem. That is, so sometimes we get angry at our friends, at our family, right? Maybe you're just in a bad mood one day and you snap at your sister or your spouse, whatever. That happens, right? But you wouldn't let it go overboard. Like you wouldn't just, not only snap at them, but start hitting them and screaming at them and just like kind of, you wouldn't take those liberties that would be so destructive for your life, right? And I think that we somehow have come to imagine that inside of the public sphere, we can just take a lot of license and get as angry as we want, and it won't matter. And worst comes to worst, maybe we'll be exiled from the public space, which we feel like I can live without it. Who cares, right? And so it's not so much like anger is just a part of life. People are going to get angry, and they're going to get angry in political contexts as well. But there's a question of what are the norms of dealing with that anger in the relevant space. And we are all pretty good about that on the whole in private. I mean, it's not as though like say spousal abuse, like that's a problem, but it's not like the norm. It's not like most people are hitting their spouses, right? And so we manage to control our anger in a lot of different arenas, and we're somehow out of control in the political space and in social media. And I would tend to be like, that's the problem, is that we somehow have maybe even devalued or desecrated those spaces, and to the point where we no longer feel like we need to control ourselves in them.
But sorry, Agnes, you mean by license, you mean that we feel entitled to be angry?
Not just
Right.
entitled to be angry, but entitled to give a kind of unlimited scope to the expression of the anger. Yeah.
All right. All right. Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed, Agnes,
My
for this
pleasure.
lively exchange. I really enjoyed it. I also enjoyed your book. Thank you very much again. And I hope I will have other occasions to read again from you.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a really fun conversation.